G'day, Michael here. This photo is it's kind of a nice photo of a swan, and it's sort of evening colours. It's a beautiful photo in its own way, but the lighting is just not working for it, and so it's basically being ruined by the way the lightness and darkness and colours are working. So what can we do to lift this thing up? Well, let's open it with Gimp. Here it comes. Zoom in a tad. Okay, so the simplest things we can do is contrast and brightness. Let's just do that right in front of me. So there's contrast and brightness. So let's just try brightness, higher and lower, and it flattens the image. But I think generally lower, bumping up the contrast. That kind of works, but I think we can do a little bit more than that. So that's kind of the limit of that simple manipulation. Let's maybe go to curves and see what curves can do for us. Colors, curves. Now this is basically the same sort of manipulation as brightness, contrast, but approached from a different way. By controlling the left hand edge, we're controlling what is the black point. So if I move that further and further over, more and more of the image becomes black. So the range of what actually is color is between the black point and the white point. That's the simplest way of putting it. Currently we're working on what's called the value, which is kind of the sum total of all the lightness and darkness. We could pick on individual colors that the camera picked up, which is red, green and blue, but that's another set of complexity we don't really need. As you can see, the bulk of the image is in this range, but there's too much detail that we want to see out on these fringes, the upper and lower limits of the photo. So by bringing the white point to the left, there's a lot of the image that's getting damaged or being chopped off. You can see this portion here is image data gone, and there's a little bit of a blip right on the hard right of the histogram here, and that's this area around the beak pretty much. This is the bulk of the image here. You can see it's still the bulk of the image is there, but this is just really overbaked. So let's just reset that. Another thing we can do is change the curve from light to dark, and you can see we can manipulate that pretty easily, and this basically affects how the gradient is thought of from black to white. And again, it's not really sort of it's got no context to work with. It's simply the brightness limit, darkness limit and contrast limit, and it doesn't really work with this photo. It just works generally over the top of the whole image, but it doesn't really work with the detail of, say, the swan's face, and doesn't work that well with the water. Okay, so how can we do this? Well, it's actually quite a simple process. Let's just duplicate that layer. Now this top layer is superimposed over the bottom layer with 100% opacity. So what we want to do is be able to maybe set a brightness limit on both of these images. So let's just do that. We've got this image highlighted, or this layer highlighted. Let's set it to our darkest levels. So let's just do that. So I'm going to make this the darkest I want any part of the image to be. So I'm leaving the white hard to the right. So I'm basically lifting the black point so as to in effect make the image become altogether darker, and we're making this the darkest that I want to see anything on the image. Okay, now the bottom layer, what I'm going to do is do the opposite. Let's just disable the top layer that we've just manipulated. You can see it's a lot darker, so I'll leave it disabled, and I'm going to set this to the upper limit, the brighter limit. So if we bring in the white point, and basically I'm pushing that as far as I can so as to produce a ceiling, really, probably mostly for this feathered area, and to some extent the darker patches of the water. Maybe about there somewhere. Anyhow, let's just try that. Okay, so this part is the lightest we want to see any part of the image, and this is the darkest. So lightest, darkest. It's quite a contrast. Now how can we do something that's a little bit more finely tuned to like local areas and so forth? Well, there's a very it's a well-established system where am I? Add a layer mask. It's called a layer mask. I'm going to pick white, which is full opacity. It's a little bit arbitrary because we're going to manipulate it. You can see we've got kind of a little icon here showing it's a little white patch. That's sort of signifying a layer mask. So let's just have a look at what that layer mask looks like. It looks like all of nothing, just a white patch. Okay, now this layer mask, let's just do something with it. Maybe we'll just do that. So I've used a line tool, a pencil tool of a given size, and let's just see what that does when we untick the show layer mask. And you can see that's created a patch where there's a hole in the front layer, our darkened image, to show the lighter image in the background. So I could do this. You can see it's not a very good tool for this job, but you can see how it works at least. So there's our portion of the background image shown through the foreground image, or the top layer. So the rear layer, the bottom layer I should say, is the lighter image, and the top layer is the darker image. And this, let's just show the layer mask. You can see what I've actually just done. I've made this little dinosaur head here. So if I do a patch like that, you'll see a diagonal line through it. So that's basically how it works. But you can see it's a pretty awful tool. So let's just go back to show layer mask. I'll undo that because it's pretty awful. Okay, so what else can we use? Let's try maybe a brush. Now a brush will give a solid representation given that brush design. So you pick the sort of brush you want. At the moment I'm just producing this round one, but we could even choose something like a, let's do that. So you can see that in business. Let's just see what that does. So it's a kind of unkind mask, but it gives us an effect. But going back to our layer mask, that's what we've just done. So I'll undo that. Right, so you can see how the brush applies whatever that shape is that we choose. So back to our layer mask. So we can do this kind of business, and it's got a soft edge. And if we use the airbrush tool, you kind of accumulate more and more of the colour. It's like spraying with a light dusting effect. So let's just see what that looks like. You can see how that works. It gently adds the darker colour. Well, actually it's the foreground colour. You can see we've got white and black as foreground and background colours. You can simply click on one of those and pick whatever the colour is. Go cancel. And if you need to invert them, you can just click on this invert tool both ways. Alright, so we can also lift that bit of the water. Whatever we feel like lifting, and we can't darken, we can lift. If we wanted to actually darken again, we can just switch that, I guess. We can darken this patch here. So what we're actually doing, just so you can see what I've just done, we're actually painting with white. We're doing this business. By inverting that, we can paint with dark. So we can lighten and darken, put patches through, and you can manipulate the imagery quite nicely that way. So let's turn off the layer mask. You see that's making it darker, invert, making it lighter. But we're working on the mask, so these colours are kind of back to front to what we see. So we can lift certain things, darken certain things, very much to how we like it. But there are other ways of doing this. Let's just I'll undo a couple of those things, get back to a... Okay, so here's our original mask. What we can do is do things like a gradient. And I'll go for a linear. And what we can do, by doing a line that long, what you'll see is the left hand edge is the dark and the right hand edge is the light point of a gradient, and then it stays, as you can see there, that designated the angle, the line that I drew designated the angle as a right angle to this sort of slope, and the darkest and the lightest shows there. Let's see what that did to our image. So if I do a little one, you can see a sharp change. Make a longer distance. Go the other way. And it's a pretty easy manipulation to handle. And any program that works with a layer mask that has a gradient or a pencil or a paintbrush tool or an airbrush tool will enable you to do this. It's not specific to Gimp, but I thought this might be useful. Now, we can also disable layer mask. So temporarily, we can just see what it looks like without the layer mask, but we haven't actually damaged our layer mask. It's still all intact. We can make it visible or not. Sorry, we would make it visible. And it's disabled, but we could still edit it, which sounds a bit complicated, but here we go. Let's just do a bit more work on that. I'm going to untick show layer mask, and I'm going to enable it again. So even though we've got this gradient that I've just created, we can lift a portion, whatever we want to highlight, whatever we want to bring up. So I've lightened this side, darkened that side of the water, and I'm just tweaking the swan's neck itself. And if I wanted to lift that bit of the water, because it looks a bit too black there, doesn't it? So just do that. So that's a bit more interesting. So let's go back and have a look at our original. That versus that. You can see it's quite a bit more interesting. What I might do is go back to Gimp. Where are we? Control Shift E is export, and I'm going to call that M for modified. How's that? Let's do that. I just click on that. And you can see what a difference that is. Here's the original, and here's our manipulated image. What's very interesting, you'd think with all the manipulation we just did, we'd have lost detail, but in fact we've gained it. If you look how that works, the droplets are much more interesting, simply because we've kind of controlled the upper and lower limits of how the exposure worked by creating the two layers that were basically our limits, and then we manipulated the layer mask to be sort of context sensitive of our image. So you can see this is a much more beautiful contrast for the feathers. This looks very flat. The water's gained a lot of interest too, and what we did was had two different layers. That one, that's our darker image, and that's our lighter image. So by setting the two images, we set our range, and by enabling the layer mask, we're able to manipulate how much of the front gets shown and how much of the back gets shown, and we can show the layer mask to see what those manipulations look like. And the outcome is quite a pleasant image from what started out as a fairly problematic image. Well, I guess that's it. Feel free to like, share, subscribe, ask a question, leave a comment. Bye for now.